Hailed as the first truly 3D mainline Pokemon games, Pokémon X and Y started development back when Generation 5 was still in its early days. Up to this point, Pokemon had gradually upped the technology and art style with each new console, and as of the DS, the mainline games were starting to take advantage of some of the 3D effects, such as using a 3D plane to build limited polygonal figures, while still heavily incorporating sprite-based work, giving the effect of depth, and even the ability for the camera to zoom, pan, and tilt to build a richer world. And Pokemon Black and White had brought that combination to an awe-inspiring peak with locations such as Castelia City. But with the coming of the 3DS, this was a machine that gave a much greater horsepower to enable the creation of games with much higher poly counts and take what already looked beautiful in this 2D 3D merger and build it in full 3D. And so through numerous test maps, animations, and an evolving concept to bring it to a concrete idea. Today on Cut Content, we shall explore the many prototype builds of Pokemon X and Y. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button too, to further support us and keep creating new videos. During the early days of building Generation 6 on the 3DS, Game Freak's main initiative was to learn the scope of 3D gaming. And so with Pokemon Black and White having released just back in September 2010, the team built a small prototype using figures from that very game to test how a 3D game can function. This as such led to the build of a 3D model of Hilda, the female protagonist of Pokemon Black and White. Two of them in fact. A chibi model for the overworld resembling much of how characters already looked in 2D, as well as a more detailed to scale model for battle. But in this case, this was all they made for a human model, and so the battle model was used in place of NPCs. All of this was functioning on a simple 4-island test map, all featuring simple buildings and trees, meanwhile coming with a dynamic day and night system and camera, a new feature to this series as a whole. Being that it was to simply get something in 3D running, collision wasn't something considered here, and the shadows clearly needed a lot of work. But what is to note is how even the water was reflective, bringing naturally a feature present since Generation 3. Meanwhile, Pokemon battles featured existing Generation 5 Pokemon, all rendered in 3D and given idle animation, likely pulled from the 3DS app Pokédex 3D. In fact, there was a mode in this build that lets you view these Pokemon in a 3D model viewer, but at this stage, an actual battle wasn't programmed in. Thus fast forward a month to January 31st, 2011. While the test map was still present, there was a lot more NPC Hildas now around. Hilariously, the map even had a placeholder theme from Mario Kart, specifically the Double Dash title theme. But while odd for the town, it is hella catchy for the actual Pokemon battle. One that finally works at last. And the Pokemon lack any animation. Yes, somehow even more so than the modern games. Despite that, attack effects are functional here. Fire, rain dance, and other moves. In addition, the model viewer doesn't just view Pokemon this time, but various objects too in the works. Along with that, the model viewer would even let the developers test out shading on Pokemon, whether it be realistic shading or even cell shading, as seen with this Tepeg here. But it was getting clear that Game Freak was starting to get the hang of building in the third dimension, and so fast forward another 5 months to June 30th, where Game Freak moved past the test map, the army of Hildas, stiff battles, and the yearning for Mario Kart. Coming with a build that featured a brand new map, and officially being branded as Pokemon X. The map in this case was a much more complex map, with roads, highly detailed objects such as houses, fences, and even bushes, controlling what is the new female protagonist in this town of Toru, complete with new compositions. While it may be a simple town with a few houses and NPC, one can exit it to what is called Route 1. But regardless, This is our first instance of tall grass to lead us into a Pokemon battle, a new highly detailed plane with the proper camera angles one is to expect, but still lacking attack animation. Otherwise, a special bench exists in this build, whereby if one sits down on it, it can speed up the day and night cycle, possibly indicating that they may have not wanted to use the 3DS's internal clock at the time. Otherwise, the only notable feature in this route is this hiker, who would like to battle you, but doesn't anyway. But the build ends in the second town, somewhat large too, with several houses and trees, all surrounded by fences, but yet no NPCs or other events around, showing how much work still needed to be done. Despite them moving past the test map build, the test still does exist in this build, and it's filled to the brim with various models of NPCs, the player character, and even replaced one of the 4 islands with a new untextured one, showing how they were likely taking anything they wanted to build in the main game, but testing it here first. But fast forward to September 30th, 2011, where everything changed. That whole original build of 2 towns, a route that featured a female protagonist, gone. Now instead came a much more stylized and completed design, the true beginnings of Kalos. This is where we see what is a familiar location that appears to be the starting town of the final game, Vanaville Town. Still being called Toru Town here, like in the previous build of that town, despite the complete revamp. Comparing the map here to the final games, there are definitely several differences, specifically every texture practically being different, from houses, grass, and floors, with house designs just different all over, and other design details such as those grass patches in front of the home. As well, they were at the time letting the player explore beyond the town's barrier like this. While it's a pretty neat feature, it is also pointless to what it accomplishes, which may be why they did start to rethink this later on. But to address the elephant in the room, the female protagonist has been remade completely. This is our first instance of Serena. Serena in this build, while having her iconic blonde hair and red hat, had a completely different wardrobe, sporting a simple white blouse and blue pants. As for Kalim, well, can't perfect what is already perfect. Serena at this stage also had the ability to swap her clothes with the flick of a button real time, likely just meant for the developers here to test, and was limited to just palette swaps and shorter hair at most. So that's where anime Serena comes from. But passing this fake fence, the original Route 1 is seen here, which more or less is still just as basic as the final games. Definitely a lot simpler compared to the original Route 1 from the previous build. Coming up to the next major town, what we know as Aquacord Town. The text here, however, reads it as a town that nestles close to the river, Rain Town, its original name. Much as before, the town has different textures, especially the ground, but otherwise, it is also closer to the final games, with the houses more or less being the same. Not so much the super simple tables and chairs here. Now, what is prominent is the appearance of 2 hikers here, likely as placeholders carried over from the previous build and eventually removed. Same goes for this one female NPC that also was carried over from the previous build. Now comes Route 2, which is actually quite different, featuring, as with before, hiker placeholders as trainers. In this instance, the road is actually off to the left and grass to the right. Now, Pokemon battles in this build actually feature a 3D model of the opponent both at the start and end of battle, which in this case is Hilda's model still being used. Who'd ever thought behind every fat male hiker is an American teenage girl? This of course eventually got changed to being just quick PNG art of trainers, probably cause Game Freak didn't want to do high poly models of every trainer. Seeing as it's simply Zekrom and Pikachu here, Gen 6 Pokemon likely still weren't made into the game yet. Bigger was that attack animations were finally in. Now horde battles do also exist at this point, which what I really like is how they were more spread out and looking in different directions, almost making it seem like you've randomly come across a number of Pokemon minding their own business, as opposed to the final games where they look ready to cut your throat. But more interestingly is how the HP bar is right next to the Pokemon it's associated with, rather than overlaid on top of the screen, a feature I do especially like better here, as you can better tell which of the HP bars belongs to which Pokemon, as opposed to trying to guess and remember who you attacked with that overlaid bar from the final game. Now on to the Viridian Forest, I mean Santaloon Forest, which was called Noke Forest at this point, which for comparison was called Hakuden Forest in the Japanese final. Now this is extremely similar to the final games, minus the hikers and the little girls. But yes, this would mean that the intention all along was always to go heavy for the Gen 1 pandering by copying the Viridian Forest. And that's as far as this build got. Going beyond the bounds, the developers had already set up some placeholder grounds in the form of these grids, but that's as far as they got. Now remember the original Toru town? Well, it's still here, and likely just a leftover at this point, lacking any and all NPCs, and in fact, some objects have been completely swapped out, and thus leaving things like this water fountain in random locations. Meanwhile, all grass suddenly becoming tall grass here too. But it's pretty clear when you see the old Toru town to the newer Toru town, and even Rain town, how the major shift happened because they finally decided to make the game take place in the French-inspired Kalos, and thus making stylized old French towns instead of these simple country locations. Now several months later, we get to December 22, 2011. Serena, while still in the same design, now wears her sunglasses on her hat. Unlike the previous build, the inside of Serena's house is made, albeit still very unfinished, and your mother is quite a bit younger than you. Going outside, Toru Town still hasn't changed much, but instead now you can actually battle Kalem, who happens to be Hilda. France is really just made of Hildas, isn't it? While not much has changed with battles, the most notable addition now are Mega Evolutions, with Gengar being able to transform into Mega Gengar. A rather different design actually. While yes, it has the spikes and third eye, the entire bottom half is still just a regular red Gengar. A much simpler design at the time, I guess. But what we now got after the battle is the actual campaign of the game finally programmed in, which speaks of them going to another town to face a gym. But what is prominent is that this was going to be a two-person adventure, rather than a merry band like the final games. But outside the gates this time that actually function, not much has changed when you go north through Route 1, Rain Town, Route 2, and the Santaloon Forest. The biggest additions were these neat camera angles at the bridge of Rain Town, which gets changed eventually of course, and finally the inclusion of overworld items to pick up. Now unlike the previous build, where it just ended on the forest, this time Kalem is waiting to beat your ass. But now we finally can go north to see an unfinished Route 3. Now based on the shape seen, it looks familiar, but the layout is definitely different. But otherwise, one can get right to Santaloon City / Hakuden City, or called at the time Naniwa City, which may or may not have been a reference to the Naniwa region of Osaka. And this city is just as unfinished as Route 3, with its basic shapes like this Pokemon Center here. The interior also being just as finished, with Nurse Serena here to attend Trainer Serena at the time. And being that this build had no restrictions, here's something that would give Professor Oak a heart attack. Otherwise, other interiors are just as unfinished too, and populated by hikers. But while extra low poly, the layout of this town is more or less the same. What is to note is several vibrating garbage bins, which if you interact with, have a trubbish within them. I guess fitting for a city, but somehow out of place for the clean image that France carries. Maybe why this was removed. Now the gym has a completely different layout. First, there is no central art gallery, or the shapes of it at least, that leads you to the main gym. And this looks nothing like the final games gym, whereby it was a giant spider web challenge. In fact, this looks a lot like Karina's gym from Chaleur City, complete with the skating trainers, the circular design, even the temp railing to take you to the center to face who is probably a stand-in for Karina. This could mean that Karina was originally set to be the gym leader of Santaloon City instead of Chaleur, and Viola was just elsewhere. Further north is our unfinished Route 4, which layout-wise isn't too different, but there are differences, like what I think are flower pots here that aren't in the final game for example. But now comes the grand star of this build, Lumio City. or somehow the even more unfinished Kaname City, unlike the final game's Japanese name of Mirai City, very much having that grid placeholder still and barely anything built on top. Some obvious collision and coloring to indicate a path in the round shape that the city is, hell even the completed city music, but otherwise, not really even explorable yet. Though it is interesting to note how they were keeping the camera overhead still at this stage, which to many is what they would have preferred the city to have stayed as. But likely Game Freak didn't know how much of a spectacle it would be where they would have the camera put behind the player just to better appreciate the city. Now, while not much more has been added beyond this, what is interesting is that there are super early maps of the Elite Four rooms. The entrance has a different camera angle then, as they likely didn't have plans yet to show the wall portraits. But eventually, like the final game, you hit the large Elite Four hub, with 4 entrances leading to each of them. The rooms, while simple, still do have placeholder blocks for the giant statue that would come in place eventually, with the second floors where you battle them having this placeholder throne, while lacking any grand effects like these dragon wings. Overall, the build added story elements, touched up old areas, and started to build more towns, but progress within the few months wasn't too hefty here. And so we jump another 5 months ahead to May 25th, 2012, and now the game is truly starting to take shape. Of course, from the get-go, you don't see that, as the player's house is still rather low poly. But what is neat is that they were initially going to give one what I presume is either supposed to be a balcony or a separate area to look outside into the low poly 3D world here. Going downstairs, we can see the first floor has been quite rearranged despite still being low poly, resembling the final game's version a lot more with the arrangement of the kitchen, stairs, and living room. Albeit your mother is basically back then still sleeping in a hole in the wall. Speaking of her, she finally has a proper model. Now, one aspect I should mention with Kalen being used here is that he does lack his sunglasses that he normally has on his hat. But once outside, we can see the final names are starting to kick in, with Toru Town finally now being renamed to its final Japanese version, Asame Town. And bigger is that the town is now almost similar to the final games, with the house designs, details, and textures all there, outside of the floor textures really. Even the Rhyhorn is in. Of course, much like your house, the other interiors are still very much a work in progress at this stage too. However, that neat ability to walk around the town's barrier is still around at this point. But bigger is that the story seems to have changed. Rather than traveling with your rival like in December, seems she is off with someone else to another town. What I presume is that this is a proto or even stand-in Shauna, as this is literally just a model of the character Sina, but a slightly earlier version still, as there are still some major differences to her dress. Now, it's hard to say if Sina's design was originally intended for Shauna before given a new design and that design got repurposed. But regardless, it seems that she does follow the same role Shauna does in the final game within this build. But the trend continues into further locations with Route 1 and now Meisui Town, formerly called Rain Town, all resembling their final game locations. Only point of detail is how Route 1 here has a caution sign of sorts. Can't really tell what that is supposed to be of. Now within Aquacord, we have a new cutscene introduced in this build that showcased not just Beta Shauna here, but as well as the other 2 friends in their beta forms. What we got in place of Tyrano is a rather slim character, and looks like an early model of Dexio, but with purple hair, similar to Sina Shauna here. Once again, can't say if this was the original intended design for Tyrano or just a placeholder. But makes you wonder that if both these designs were intended here, that if Tyrano and Shauna were supposed to be related initially. In the case of Trevor, this isn't a model that is similar to anything and looks like a less deformed Animal Crossing villager. With Route 2, while starting to resemble the final games in the first half, the second half is basically just a straight line to the Santaloon Forest, which of course, Sina Shauna here, doing exactly what she does in the final game of stalking you here. But Route 3 is where we see the game finally coming to shape, where it actually has final objects in place, for the most part, minus whatever this green thing is here. Now Santaloon City as well, looking a lot more finished too at this point, with the fountain even in place. But textures were still quite different, especially with anything on the floor, as well as some objects and buildings remaining untextured. Same goes for the Pokemon Center, which had a darker floor here and different front walls, and even the shop desk being smaller. Interestingly, Santaloon Gym, while the exterior still has one of the skaters of the previous build, didn't have Chaleur Gym here anymore. The interiors now had been shifted to the proper spiderweb gym with Viola as the gym leader, or a placeholder of her at least. And in battle, she's simply Sinnoh Gym Leader Candace. Viola just can't catch a break. With Route 4, it is looking a lot more complete as well, but once more with older ground textures in place. Meanwhile, the center fountain and the back gate still under heavy construction, complete with red steel beams to show that. While Lumiose City was more or less non-existent in the previous build, it is finally in the making. We finally got tall buildings up, and even a ground texture to cover those tiles. It's actually a city at last. More interesting is that much like the previous build, they were still going with the overhead camera here, which shows how confusing this city would have been if they had stuck to this. Using a debug camera, one can get a better look of this early Lumiose City and see the basic shape that was Lumiose Tower, or Lumiose Gym if you will, and even the archway. But better yet, you can see how extensively they had built the many buildings at this point on their way to make this crown jewel. Meanwhile, it seems the Lumiose hairstylist was around at this point, and a lot sketchier looking. Straight to Route 5, one that still is in quite a bit of work here, even if a lot is already textured. The skate park is still no-go for one, but soon we make it to the next town, Camphor Town, but completely unfinished, and low poly of course. In fact, it's not just low poly, it's lacking all buildings minus the Pokemon Center. Basically, it's in an even worse shape than the previous Santaloon City, but interestingly, a more complete version of this does exist in this build as well, separate from the main map, that at least has the building structures in place, and even this stone structure in place of the fountain at the moment. And seems the tradition continues into Route 7. The layout, while similar, does deviate at the end, where it seems there is a path northward to what may have been an alternate or original entrance to the connecting caves here, and the bridge in the middle that led to the Battle Chateau leads to a forest instead. Now this would be a good time to bring up the town map of these builds. Up to this build, the town map was quite a bit larger than the final games, including this whole southern region, to give us a full and complete map of France for Kalos. In this instance, there was an island here called the Battle Island, which I theorize was where both the Battle Chateau and Battle Maison could have been intended. Or so I did think, at least that was why the Battle Chateau wasn't here. But it seems a later version of this map in the same build does pop in an early model of the Battle Chateau. So it's clear that they simply decided that they just didn't want a plain forest here. Thus, in place was just a forest here, until they cut that island, and possibly moved that portion of the Battle Chateau here. For those interested in a more in-depth coverage on the cut southern Kalos, I have done a video on that too, which going north, we enter into what is an early Route 6, with its camera being initially a lot lower and behind the player directly. I presume these black blocks are placeholders for putting in trainers one is to encounter here, leading us to an extra early Parfum Palace. While hardly built and definitely no bonding between Calum and Protoshana this early in development, one can already see that this is a very different interior. And I'm not talking about how low poly it is. The layout in this case is a lot tighter for one, and lacking certain walls and even placeholders for some objects. But interestingly, a lot of the bedrooms you can enter are in the same map, as opposed to being in separate maps, and they all come complete with placeholder beds. The very door leading to the back exists as well, but it seems the bridge and water aren't made yet. Just flat square textures just to represent where to go. While the hedge base here is represented simply by solid green polygons, it is clear that the shape of the maze were quite a bit simpler. Jumping back to Route 7, the other end of it of course leads to an early connecting cave, which in comparison to the final games is a lot shorter, and only one direct path instead. Switching gears, let's talk about this mysterious map here of what looks to be a cave or a route, with varying heights and entrances. As far as I have compared, it doesn't compare to anything in the final game. Stranger is that just south of it is Geosinge Town. meaning we may have had a northern location to Geosinge that was cut eventually. As for Geosinge Town, this extra blocky version of this town is simply mapped out to the many houses lined around the 3 stones in the middle. Interestingly, the path to the left has these stairs that go underneath, which may be the original entrance to the Team Flare HQ. Stranger is that a right path exists too for this said entrance as well. This extends down to Route 10 and 11 too, with how low poly they get, especially with these graves. Solage City being in a similar vein too, with some minor layout differences, but ultimately, the zigzag path up the mountain was here this early. Now interestingly, later versions of these very locations are here too, which shows that the gap between the last and current build had 2 versions made of these. Route 10 with large graves now, and Geosinge just having so many more details and objects in place. Still quite different from the final games, but it's clear that it was finally being worked in a more finalized capacity. In fact, a house is in place of where the Team Flare HQ is supposed to be now instead of stairs. Solage City in this case, while still blocky, has a much more detailed and textured floor, along with some houses actually modeled somewhat instead of being big cubes, showing how during the stage of development, an idea they had was to construct a location in a more miniature, simple form, and then expand that into the grander forms later. Along with that, we got Solage Gym with the full rock climbing challenge already in place. Despite being blocky, all the pieces are already more or less in place. But going further down, we get to Route 8. While still in early development, the layout is more or less exactly the same. Got it in one go. But what we come to is Amber Town, which has the clear aquarium here in its perfectly cubical design, but no Pokemon Center, and that's it. They really did make this area for an aquarium as a basis for making a whole town. To the right is Glittering Cave, and back then it sure wasn't being viewed from behind, along with it having a lack of glitter here. Just a generic cave then. Further north, we get to Chaleur City, which in its earliest state has nothing but the Tower of Mastery, which doubles as Chaleur Gym back then. And well, if this city is this unfinished, I shouldn't be surprised with how it's just one giant block. Now, while no real entry has been made, there is a separate map for Chaleur Gym with Karina, who in the previous build was the gym leader of Santaloon City. Seeing as how Viola kicked Karina out of Santaloon Gym, it's likely that she and her gym are now in Chaleur proper. But compared to before, Chaleur Gym is looking a lot more built, with skaters not being hikers for one, and the placeholder platforms being a bit more altered. Bigger are these giant boulders that skate around the edge of the gym, which I guess if the Tower of Mastery was just Chaleur Gym back then, it could justify having such grand architecture like this. Ultimately, the same placeholder Karina is still here. Going right is Route 12, and it's quite different layout-wise. Not much matches up. Lack of sand, trees that block this path, areas like this that never did exist in the final game. Even the water was redesigned from a stream to more of a river, and the gate was just all the way to the south instead. It seems unlike most routes, this got a complete overhaul by the end. Now the city to the right is Comarine City. While the boats are here, there are several major differences around, such as the lack of a lighthouse, and the boats on the lower end not being there yet. Now with more of the game in development, including the later locations, we can see just north of Lumiose City, the forested Route 14, full of its swamps and trees, which floor tiles currently represent, and tree stumps represented by these B-cubes. Interestingly, the trees that overlay the screen are represented by these thick web of polygons, while the playground is still here too in its simple geometry, including the slide and swings. And further up is an early Lavier City, and surprisingly, it looks quite a lot more finished than most other locations. It may still have simple blocks and early textures, and even this 2D cutout representing this structure, but compared to the cities just west of it, it's in another century. Even has the autumn theme in already. Gym is also here, and it is still in a very rough shape, but the teleporter puzzle is here and active, though the camera doesn't zoom out and in just yet. Further north is the Pokeball Factory. Unlike Lavar, it's barely been started, just the basic shapes. Much like Parfum Palace, the insides are a huge work in progress. Some things have been laid out for conveyor belts and other structures, but the second floor is especially simple and seems much like Parfum Palace, The two side rooms were part of the actual map here and centered, unlike the final map, which had them in the corner. Jumping to the east is Route 15, and let this set the mood for how unfinished the east is. Giant green polygons everywhere to, I guess, represent areas we're not supposed to go to, and these temp leaf tiles to represent fallen leaves. At the very least, the layout does look very similar to the final route, but not so much Route 17, a very, very different Route 17. Based on the white tiles, it is clear it is supposed to be a snowy landscape, and I guess these would become pine trees, something lacking in the final game. More interesting is that there is grass, which is definitely not there. Otherwise, nothing of this layout remotely resembles the final Route 17. In fact, has a cave here that leads straight to the Frost Cavern. As such, some might say that the path leads into the actual cavern and was just called Route 17 then, as that did at least have trees, but still a very different layout and no grass too. And even within the Frost Cavern, it is quite different layout-wise. It's ridiculously simple actually, showing how these ice regions were still in quite the early planning, maybe even just putting something bare bones in place until they actually sat down and planned it. But returning to the journey to the east is the early Anistar city, and its layout is quite different, having simple squarish land and the houses all next to each other. Not sure what this giant cylinder is supposed to be, but based on what is to the northwest in the final game, it's likely the giant sundial used in the post game for upgrading your Mega Ring. Otherwise, house locations and many other details are just not there, but the path south to the route exists, leading us to Route 19, which isn't the correct name here. This is actually Route 18 from the final game, but I guess they had different plans back then. Unlike Anistar, this one is very similar to the final game's layout. They even got that rail there back then, let alone the whole rail system was in the works, and the layout for that is even perfectly in line. Curway Town is just below, and we're back to another rather different early town. Unlike the final game, with the big train station here, it seems this was just a straight up waterfall, and once you go south of that bridge, it's all different. The right side is blocked off by the waterfall mountain entirely, but what is of note is the structure here with this polygon going up the mountain. Taking a page out of Ruby and Sapphire, I wouldn't be surprised if the original intention was to use this to take a ride up the mountain across to the other side of the map, which for the moment had nothing of note besides water and land. On to Route 21, an early version with a similar layout to the final games, but with some interesting differences, like this mysterious cave that is not there in the final game, but at this stage it is inaccessible. Seeing as it is the route that takes you to Victory Road, this is probably what leads to it. But what we really are here for is the city to the right and south of Coroway, Snowbell City, and it looks nothing like Snowbell. The irony that it's raining in Snowbell. But seriously, the layout doesn't match at all. These structures are all over the place. Like, I think this one is supposed to be this in a bit of a different location. No idea what this is supposed to be. The blue building in the middle seems to be the only thing that survived into the final game as Snowbell Gym. Just south is Route 21 again, which is mislabeled, as this is actually Route 20. Isn't very built yet. Not yet the Pokemon version of the Lost Woods here, but beyond that is the Pokemon Village, I think. Because this definitely isn't the Pokemon Village we know. It actually has a house surrounded by water. Possibly this was intended as something else entirely at the time, or maybe the Pokemon Village of that era had a hermit who lived with them, making me wish that this house stayed into the final game to meet whoever took care of the Pokemon here. Jumping to the Pokemon League now, while the entrances and even some of the rooms haven't changed much, Elite Four Malva's room, however, is basically finished, with the crazy fire effect active at last. Only minor details like the surrounding flames and some wall textures are missing really. Otherwise, that is as far as locations that are somewhat built are at this point. Some other locations like this cave that may be Terminus Cave in an early form do exist, which the reason it might be Terminus Cave is based on some layout details, but otherwise development was still quite a long way off. And other locations not mentioned hadn't even started yet. However, there is also a special test map that the developers were using to build locations on. Likely the way this went down was that they would be building these simple ideas here and copying them into the main map of the game to lay over the grid floors, and based on this, it seems a lot of work was being done here. With how simple the geometry is, it is hard to decipher what these are and where they would belong to. Now, as for Pokemon battles, it is here where we see Hilda finally dropped for the PNG trainers instead. Which I guess, being only a year and a half away from launch, Game Freak really didn't want to risk spending time to build high poly models for everyone. Despite that, it seems Gen 6 Pokemon are in, but not modeled yet. Instead, they are just billboard images as placeholders, till they finish them. However, one point of note is the battle pose for Pikachu here, looking very locked into battle as opposed to both the previous build and even the final build. Odd that this pose was removed. Now just a few months further comes the next build on September 30th, 2012. Now what this build does off the bat is introduce a radically new design for Serena, going for his twin tail look with a cap, shorts, and a blue shirt at that. At this stage, much of the earlier towns were coming to a more finalized state, and the later towns starting to actually take shape with textures at long last finalized for such locations too. Even Shauna now being given her final design. In fact, when you see the first cutscene of the friends, even Tierno and Trevor have their final designs in place too. Only you're now in a phase, Serena. Santaloon City is basically complete. Just ground textures are different now. Otherwise, every building is made and there. Lumiose City is back, and while still looking very much in the making, the big difference is that they finally put in the proper camera behind the player to appreciate what is this in the making Golden City. An interesting point is how there is an entire part of the map that dips below Lumio's tower, which from an architectural standpoint is an absolute nightmare. But this is something that was around as early as even the first flat build of the city, but here it is now after all the work in its steady evolution. Now let's jump to some really unfinished western areas like Campfire Town, which is finally finalized. Yeah, some ground textures and objects are in different locations and full of these shadow people, but the town has come a long way in just a few months. Not so much the interiors like Hotel Campfire. While it looks rough, the layout is more or less finalized as everything pretty much lines up with what is in the final game. Just needs high poly models and textures now. Route 7 in this case is getting a lot closer to the final build, but the daycare is hardly made yet. Thus, if we go into Route 6, we get what are the early surrounding areas that weren't made yet in the previous build. And the big path forward, however, not so much and full of shadow people. Strangely, the camera was reset to being overhead here instead of falling behind like it did previously. Guess they may have changed their mind by the final game. Glittering Cave is here too, in a finalized state with that camera finally behind the player, layout and all. But the Deep Cave, however, is still quite unfinished, even if the layout is, complete with Team Flare members in the waiting. Jumping to Route 10, while more complete than before, one major point now is how much smaller the graves are. I do feel the larger graves did give a better feeling of awe on what transpired in the past. But what about Geosenge Town, which was in a very bare bones state, and now even featuring the ultimate weapon. In the rebuilding of this town, it seems they got rid of the Team Flare HQ on the left path, and even the original stairs on the right are not there. Either they were trying to repurpose the location, or they were trying to decide which path to use. Might be why the right path does go away after. Otherwise, some things still do need finalizing, like these bits here and the stone gate, which is a ladder gate at this point. While the town is mostly finalized, what about the interiors? Nope, still a polygon hell. This being the Hotel Marine Snow, which much like Campfire Hotel is using the exact same temp layout before building upon it. Going just east, we come to Chaleur City, actually being made this time. Last time it was just ground and the very blocky looking Tower of Mastery, which led to the gym. Hilariously, while the city's layout is made 1-to-1, the path to the tower is more or less untouched. At least entering it, we do have a new entrance leading to the regular Tower of Mastery, and even its interior room instead of the gym. Now, the gym is in its rightful place. The inside of the gym hasn't changed much at all, however. onto Comarine City, which is more finalized this time, despite still using early ground textures. But what we really want to get to is Route 13. Route 13 is an infamous route to many, as it is where the ever-elusive power plant is. However, it is heavily theorized to have had much more to it, but just cut like so much else was. It is clearly in an early state, similar to much of what was in the previous builds, as they just clearly started working on this. Despite that, the layout was well planned already, and even had railings in place. The power plant, however, was still limited to these doors you can never use to enter, at the time being of course complete cubes. Whether the theories are true or not, even this early they never attempted to build more of the power plant beyond this. Going north of Lumio City, nothing really has changed with Route 14 yet, except the playground does look more finished now, especially in terms of the swings and slide, despite still needing a bit more work. Going to Frost Cavern this time, it looks a lot closer to the final games, with its exterior actually made, or simply what was possibly called Route 18 then, and the layout being very similar to the final games, this even going as far as the interiors, down to even having a sign for your bike and skates. But otherwise, layout is 1-to-1 now, showing how the eastern side finally is being given consideration that is sorely needed. Route 19 is in, and already in a pretty finalized state, unlike much of the eastern routes, with even these special flowers being here. Snowbell City is still pretty incomplete. In fact, I think this may be untouched. Everything is still looking very different from the final games outside of, once again, our blue gym. Route 22 is here. While yes, the top area is still pretty much in line, including Victory Road, the southern half, however, has some differences. While the Chamber of Emptiness is here, the river system goes down quite a bit further and has a turn. And then there is the dam in place of the waterfall. Or at least that was my first instinct when I saw it. But really it's just a placeholder block, because they hadn't designed the waterfall yet. Now with the Pokemon League, while we had a pretty complete Malva room last time, this time it is truly complete. Minus Malva herself. Just got some placeholder Team Flare model, which I guess is fitting seeing as she was actually a member of Team Flare. Test rooms already existed in the previous build, but this time is a more traditional test room, whereby instead of having big locations built here, instead was testing out aspects such as objects, including numerous different signs and railings, and even wild Pokemon battles. Pokemon battles haven't changed too much in this case, but we do see a clear high-res model for this version of Serena. Interestingly, Beta Shauna, or possibly now Cena, is here too, which triggers a Pokemon battle with Kalim, featuring more cardboard cutouts of Gen 6 Pokemon, and even some other generations like this Gardevoir here. I guess while Gen 6 just wasn't sculpted, some of the others still were being imported, programmed, and animated before given their proper models. Now speaking of battles, Super Training was now in, and in a very early state with tile flooring, very eerie locations, and these Shadow Pokemon. This looks far more like a Dynamax battle from Sword and Shield. Makes you wonder where the influence from that came now. But otherwise, it still did function like the Super Training as we know it. And seemingly, no Pokemon just explodes. Yeah, this wasn't just a balloon you were attacking back then. Just early Dynamax Pokemon for EVs. But now the unfortunate has happened. Opening up the town map, one can see that the southern half of Kalos has been entirely cut, roughly 1 year before release. While it is unfortunate, and many would wonder why this would have happened, seeing as how this game is still this unfinished with a year of development left, Game Freak likely realized that they wouldn't be able to complete the game if they still had to build those locations that they hadn't touched yet. By November 2012, the game was starting to actually look like the final game, especially since they backpedaled on Serena, and we not only did get her old design back, but now finalized with her iconic dress too. By January 31st, 2013, the story was coming to a halt, as cutscenes and storyboards were starting to be used in game. This includes the opening cutscene when one sees Serena with Shauna, which interestingly, Serena is depicted with her beta clothing instead, showing that these cutscenes may have been made a good while earlier before implemented in. along with a stitched-together storyboard cutscene for the story of AZ, Eternal Flowette, and the Ultimate Weapon, a work-in-progress cutscene of Kalen imposing his dominance over an extra blocky Xerneas coming free, even the final cutscene of the game where AZ meets with a protagonist and reunites with the Eternal Flowette, which had a placeholder design for AZ that was basically using a modified white-haired model of Professor Sycamore, and whatever his ritual Serena is trying to do with the Ultimate Weapon. But from here to release, the locations were set and just refined and built upon, with the final map adding several additional locations that were not in the last build, possibly some that they never had programmed in the first place, and maybe some to make up for the locations that they may have even had planned for Southern Kalos. But all in all, after 3 years of testing, understanding the 3D environment, constant changes, and plenty of cut content, Pokémon X and Y released on October 12, 2013. And while many ideas were clearly scrapped, there was one more build made just prior to release on May 21, 2013, a build labeled as Version Z. An early attempt to try to complete the ideas in a third version, going only so far as to just flipping the Pokémon X title screen upside down on the top screen and having Yveltal on the bottom screen as some form of merged indicator. While nothing much is different with that, it has some clear and odd experimentations with it, such as this purple Bulbasaur that is just a PNG, and crazy enough, the ability to Mega Evolve a Charmander into a Mega Charmander. But whatever the developers had in mind was scrapped, as they went to work on Generation 3 remakes, and then had Generation 6 come to an abrupt end, leaving many of those loose ties unsolved. But the path to get here was regardless one that had Game Freak learned to make a functional 3D Pokemon game with the beautiful world of Kalos, sometimes having to face extra hard feats that took well over a year to make, such as Lumiose City that became the crown jewel of the game, one that Game Freak is returning to and building it bigger and brighter than ever before for an entire game known as Pokemon Legends ZA. And thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back for more Pokemon and other games cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on how you feel about Game Freak's method of developing this game. So everyone, thank you for watching.